just the idea of zooming out and looking at the big, what's the purpose here and where are we?
Welcome to With You Podcast. I'm David.
And I'm Tara.
I'm a marriage and family therapist and professor.
And I'm a birth doula and educator.
And we're married to each other. We've raised 4 kids, and we're in professions, as you see, that deal with coming alongside people.
Right. So in this podcast, we're going to share what we've learned about relationships and life transitions. We'll do that by sharing our own experiences, by interviewing people who have a great story to tell. Mm-hmm. And we've got some expert interviews to give us some even better information.
It's going to be so good. Let's get started.
Please join us.
Welcome to today's podcast. Today, we're going to kind of look at a couple of things that are cornerstone to us as we think about different relationship and life transitions.
Right. So we'll be doing a lot of storytelling and things, but before we get there, we wanted to just talk about some of the things we find most important and give foundation and context to all of those things.
Yeah, so you can kind of get to know our thinking and where we're coming from, and then we'll build from there. So the first topic is
perspective.
Perspective.
Getting the big picture of where we're coming from, which we find really helpful in terms of understanding our kids, other people, and our own relationship. Just having perspective of what else is going on, where are we coming from, helps us see the big picture.
Yeah, and it makes me think of like when our kids were little, we did road trips. And we covered a lot of ground. The family was in states that were about 19-hour drive away. So you do need some perspective when you're driving with kids cross country for 19 hours.
Yeah. We actually really loved a road trip.
Yeah, it was fun, but we needed to have perspective of what we were in for, kind of where our end point was, how long it might take us, and where we were starting. And so as I think about perspective, I think about maps and GPSs that we would use, especially with technology now. The GPSs, is that a word?
Plural?
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know either, but the GPS that we had, and I named ours Magic because it was just magic how it got us there. Magic we'd put in the end goal or the location, and it would give us 2 or 3 different options depending on if we wanted scenic route, fastest route.
If we really want to date ourselves, do you remember the AAA triptych?
Oh, yeah. Those were great.
Yeah.
You could flip it over.
Get a whole folder full of printed pages.
Marked gas stations.
Mm-hmm.
So good.
Yeah. So the map was helpful, but in the days when our kids were little, we even used the big Rand McNally map, the big book that had all the different states in it. We'd use that to get us. How many states did we drive across? 5?
5.
Something like that.
About right. And it always got a little sketchy when you got to the edge of the map, edge of the state, because then you'd have to be in 2
turn
pages.
Your page. Yeah. So that's one way we think about big picture perspective is, in those times when you're in some small town and you're driving through and you're wondering how far you have to go, zooming back and looking at the whole map makes you realize how far you've come to get there and gives you an idea of how far you have to go.
That's right. And it's helpful to have other people join you in that perspective. There was one of our trips where we were driving out west and family was following us, a caravan of 2 cars. And I guess I'll confess,
this was my
driving.
mistake. Yeah. I took a nap. So we usually take turns driving. You were driving.
I was driving.
I took a nap.
I think I was humming a little song in my head.
Right.
And we were driving to Colorado.
Uh-huh.
And I think you
from
woke
Illinois.
up from Illinois.
I woke up.
And what state were we in?
Well, I woke up and thought, I just enjoy watching the world go by, and I saw a "Welcome to Missouri" sign.
That's correct. And if anybody knows your geography, get out your maps right now. Illinois to Colorado, Missouri is not a direct route in between.
It's not the way we were planning on going. So I thought I was dreaming. We had to pull over real quick.
Yep, in a shady gas station, and we had to get some new perspective.
We did.
Because we were not where we belonged, and we had kind of gotten off the map. And so this was a zooming out moment, right? We had to zoom out. And honestly, we constantly, when we have little moments like this, we're in between frustration and laughter. We
Right.
do find it funny, and yet it is also
And
frustrating.
yet we've also added a few hours to our trip.
Yeah.
So this is where perspective also matters, and where you're going to decide to say this is a huge problem or this is the scenic route. It's called
Yeah.
taking the scenic route.
And we did find some interesting
We
kind of
did.
cornfields that we drove through with our friends, and they have their kids have never let me forget it.
No, I don't think any of us have forgotten that.
No.
But it's a fun story.
It is a fun story, and it does help us think about this bigger perspective. And when we're thinking about development, when we're thinking about our kids, when we're thinking about our relationship, we have these moments where we might get off track or lose perspective, and having to pause and make those decisions of like, okay, how are we going to respond to this as we
Right.
do get
And
perspective?
just the idea of zooming out and looking at the big, what's the purpose here and where are we? So our purpose was to get to Colorado. Did
Yeah.
we still get to Colorado? Yeah, we did.
Yeah,
And we had an adventure along the way. So
and
that's
a great story.
right. I mean, and that's partly what we think about perspective. It's the frame you put on it. It's looking at what was the purpose here to begin with, and did
Yeah.
we still got to our destination.
And I think that leads into kind of another kind of idea of perspective of that's the big picture piece. I think we also need to zoom in. So we zoom out, and then zooming in. Tara and I were just recently at the Art Institute, and one of my favorite pictures is a Sunday afternoon on the island of Le Grand Jaff. I think that's the right title.
We're going to try to use some French words.
Yeah, yeah. It's Georges Seurat, and he's a pointillist. And if you know your art, pointillism is where there's all these little dots of paint. If you get really up close, you can see the individual kind
Sort
of
of like
markings of paint.
The pre-pixelation. Now
Oh,
we'd call it
yeah.
like pixelation. But if you get really close to that painting, all you see is a bunch of dots. You can't see a picture.
Yeah, and it's really fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not until you step back that you appreciate those small moments or those small pieces of paint lead to a bigger picture. And so part of the idea of perspective is we're wanting to be moving between the big picture GPS and getting into, we do have to put those little pieces of little moments, little pieces of paint
That look like they don't really matter,
yeah.
but they're all part of the big picture.
And it builds to something that can be quite beautiful with some perspective.
Right.
The other perspective I thought of was Ratatouille. Remember that movie?
Yeah.
The grumpy kind of food taster.
Oh, right. The food critic.
Food critic, that's
Yeah.
the word. Yeah. He was sitting in the restaurant, and Remy came out and was like, what? Or Remy's puppet boy came out. And
I don't even know where you're going with this. So I'm just listening,
So,
wrapped.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he comes out, and the food critic's there, and they're like, well, what would you like me to make? And he's like, give me some perspective. And so they went back into the kitchen, and he made this nice thing of ratatouille. And the perspective really connected him back to his childhood too. So we have this big picture perspective. We have these small moments, and we have the history that informs us. So all of these things kind of go into perspective.
To contribute to the whole, the
Yeah.
context matters.
Yeah, I would like to think I'm classy and can just talk art history all the time, but I also just love cartoons. So that kind of the next part of perspective I think we want to talk about is how do we get unstuck sometimes, or even realize that we have a perspective, and getting out of our own point of view.
So it's about POV, point of view, which is important part of movie making.
Yeah.
So whose perspective are we coming from? And I think
True.
that's partly why we get stuck in problems and in raising kids and in relational issues, is that we're only coming from our own perspective. So we really value ways to find to hear other people's stories and to learn about the world from other points of view.
Yeah. I think that's so important, because like we think our perspective is the truth or is it, and it's not until we kind of can step outside of that. And there's lots of ways to do that, but the first part of that is realizing, my perspective is I'm bound by my body, my eyes, my location,
My culture, my
Yeah.
my community,
family upbringing, family rules.
right? So
all of
when we
that.
step outside of that a little bit, it really helps to see somebody else's point of view, even in just listening to somebody else in a relationship.
Yeah.
Even our own children, we have 4 kids. We think they'd all have the same point of view. They've grown up in the same house, but they're all different.
Yeah.
They all have their own way of interpreting our the way we parent them, the world they live in.
One of the things to help kind of challenge their points of view has been travel, like we talked earlier on, of driving to Colorado and seeing family in other parts of the country can really be helpful. I grew up in a small town in western Michigan, and I didn't like going 15 miles out of town was like a big day trip. And I didn't really realize the perspective that I had, what I just thought was
That it
normal,
was limited.
that it was limited, and it
Hmm.
was kind of bound by culture and bound by family. And it wasn't until I went to college and then have traveled with you that I've learned more and more what was cultural norms and how it can be different, not necessarily right or wrong, but different. And it's only through exposure to those ideas and those experiences that you can have that difference.
Yeah. And it's hard work to live outside our own perspective,
It
and
is.
it can be painful even. But we highly value travel, especially for that.
Yeah.
We've really tried to help our kids live outside. We have raised them in a suburban town with its own perspective and culture. So we've tried to expand their worldview a little bit and our own by traveling, by learning other languages, listening to other people's stories.
Yeah, and it provides you new possibilities, new solutions, but it also can be new struggles. I mean, one of the places we lived for 4 months, we didn't speak the language, and things like buying groceries caused me to kind of
Get the
pit
nervous
sweat.
sweats.
Yeah, totally. And come back, you're like, "Where's the lunch meat?" And I'm like, "I didn't know how to order it, and I didn't know how to pay for it. The money's different." That a different perspective can be uncomfortable.
Yeah. But that really helped us appreciate and understand the people who live in our country who, don't understand the language, or it's hard for them to navigate the school system and all of those things.
Yeah. So perspective can also help you connect with others in addition to finding solutions and finding new possibilities. I think the last thing I can think of about perspective is so what? All right. So we have this kind of idea of big perspective, pulling out, getting close, thinking about how it connects to our growing up and then the context that we grow in. Um, I
This
think
is this is where I love the mountain metaphor.
okay.
So
Yeah. Tell us about
this
that.
is, people might notice in all of my logos and in my office, there's a lot of pictures of mountains, and that's because I find mountain climbing to be a really helpful metaphor for any challenging thing in our life.
Hmm.
And relationships are a challenge, and raising kids, and
Marriage.
right,
Yeah.
transitional times in our lives
Hmm.
are challenging. And so it's helpful to break it down. That's part of our perspective picture. So for me, I climbed mountains often with my dad. That was one of the things he
Hmm.
loved to do. And it's when you look at the mountain looming in front of you, it looks impossible. It looks so far away. It looks so high up. And we think of that with a lot of challenging things in our lives. So the way to start is just to take one step, right?
Yeah.
With any hard thing, it can look too hard until you take one step. And as you keep taking one step in front of the other, you eventually reach your destination.
Hmm.
And I use that metaphor often for my clients when we're talking about birth, because obviously it's a challenge,
Hmm.
and it's a finite challenge. We know there's going to be an end. The babies always come out one way or another, but it's challenging looking ahead to it. Most people feel like, I'm not sure how I'm going to cope. It sounds scary, just like many hard things in our lives. So I use the mountain as a way to think about it, kind of that zooming out approach of like, you're going to get to the top. That's our final destination. There's a few different routes we can take to go
Hmm.
up the mountain. There's different pathways. Sometimes we plan one path and a challenge comes up, like we drive into Missouri instead of instead of across Iowa or whatever. But that doesn't stop us from getting to our destination. It's just a different route. It's
Right.
just we've been rerouted, and that's okay. And so it's helpful to think about it that way, and to think that when we take one step at a time, it's a small point. It's that little dot of paint
Yeah.
that helps us get to the final picture.
So good. And and there's an exhilaration to that, both in the moment and when you get to the top.
Yeah, and when you're in the middle of it, you can't really see.
No, I know the hikes you've taken me on, and she
Yeah.
says they're not hikes, they're torture devices. We have a different experience of mountain climbing, but we go through hikes and you can't see where you are.
No.
It's hard to have perspective other than the next step.
Yeah, because you're literally in the trees. You
Yeah.
can't see beyond where you are. You can't see how far you have to go.
I know. I would sit there. Well, yeah, I know we're supposed to be hiking, but I would sit a lot during our hikes. I'd sit there going, I don't know. I want to know how far it is, how much more time. I can't do this. I may or may not have cried a little bit, but it's without the perspective, it can feel futile. It can feel overwhelming and just wanting to quit.
Mm-hmm.
And having someone that's with you, providing that perspective, is really beneficial and kind of provides hope. And that's where we come from in terms of thinking about perspective as a cornerstone to what we're wanting to share as we talk with people.
And thank you for the with you part, because I forgot to mention that too, that you should never hike alone.
Yeah.
So that's a part of our cornerstone way of thinking, is that we're not meant to do this alone, any of this stuff alone. So all of our perspective ideas are going to have to do with relationship and doing this together.
Well, I'm glad I get to do this with you.
Yeah, me too.
And with the people listening. We're going to look at another foundational piece of With You podcast. So we are talking in this about development.
And there's a lot to unpack with development, but it's important to us in the way we think about relationships, just other people, organizations.
Yeah. Development happens for everybody and everything. It's interesting because our relationship started in a developmental class on some level.
That's true. I didn't think about that.
Yeah. So we have development from our our toes, the foundation of our marriage, friendship, and kind of connection has been around development in odd kind of way.
Child development class.
That's
junior
where we
year of college.
Got to know each other.
Yeah.
I actually only took it so I could hang out with you, but that's a whole nother story. So every person has, and every relationship has, various cycles, stages, changes that happen. And we think about that as development.
Right. Because, you hear in relationships, sometimes people will say, "You're not the same person I married."
Hey, have you ever said that?
No, I don't think I ever expected that. But I think that it's good to remember that everything is changing.
Yeah. And that if not, that's stagnation. And there's different types of development. There's kind of the stage development. We talked about that in our class when we learned that way back in the
stages of human development.
Somethings. Yeah. Stages of human development. It's that like a young child, adolescent, adult, that kind of idea that there's a task that you have to accomplish before you can move on. One of my favorites is Piaget, right? He has all those little tasks that kids have to do, and it's fascinating. They all make the same mistake at the same age. So they can't tell water staying the same amount in different jars up until a certain age, and then they can start seeing it differently. And so there's this kind of, you have to have certain development, certain brain development to be able to do the task, and then you move on to the next stage.
Right, which makes a lot of sense for context and how we understand human behavior and how we expect people to behave.
Yeah, and it's going to be for relationships too. It's not just kids and not just people. So we'll talk more about that. There's also organic kind of development, like you see out in nature or in our backyard in terms of plants. We do better at raising people than we do plants.
Yeah, we're not green thumbs.
No, so maybe we like stage theory better than organic development. But if you think about development, it's just a slow progression moving along, and there's not necessarily tasks but it's just morphing and changing over time.
Yeah. So the idea of growth is always happening, and how do we contribute to that, and how does that help us understand where we are?
Yeah.
in relationship.
We could take that plant metaphor really far of like, you also need a bunch of crap to fertilize that growth happening. But everything, every person, every relationship has these times of change. Another part of development is understanding behavior in the context of this growth and development. So how do we make sense of behavior, our partner's behavior, our family members, our parents, our kids' behavior? How does it make sense? And usually having a developmental lens can help us see and make sense of that behavior a little bit clearer.
Yeah, it makes a big difference in how we think about what somebody's doing. I mean, you helped me a lot with that because I don't know if you guys understand that David's PhD is in child development. So he loves to geek out about this stuff. So it always comes around to development.
I'm working so hard not to like give a 4-hour lecture right
I know.
now.
We've worked hard on keeping it short.
Yep.
But the idea of understanding humans in relation to where they are developmentally really helps with understanding this. All of our concepts fit together. So this fits with perspective as well. But you helped me a lot when our kids were little and, you have a 2-year-old throwing a tantrum and we can tend to say, attach a personality trait to that.
Yeah.
Say he's being stubborn or he's being impossible, defiant, and understanding that he's 2 and his task is to maintain that his thoughts are different than your thoughts and he's frustrated really helps to put a different frame on it and helps you react differently.
Yes. And that makes a whole different developmental trajectory in our relationship with our kids or our partners. If I see it differently, it frees me up to respond differently.
Right.
If I think you're being defiant, Tara, then that's going to get a certain response.
Especially if we label it out loud like that.
Right.
If you tell a child, you're so stubborn, maybe it's self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Instead of, I see that you're struggling. It's hard to be 2 and to have these big feelings and to not be able to express them. It brings about a really different reaction.
Yeah. And that is huge in terms of parenting, dealing with our parents, dealing with each other, that if I can have a different perspective and if I can have it grounded in, this is somewhat of a normal trajectory. Like we all talk about, I even don't like saying it, the terrible 2s. Right.
Because we'll get to that in language.
Yeah. But all of a sudden we're thinking terrible thoughts.
Right.
Developmentally. And, but if we think of, okay, what's their task, right? Stage theory. What are they supposed to be doing? Then we realize, okay, so I get to help shape this versus, that child's defiant and you need to respect me. It's
right.
And it's simple,
but it's a big piece for teenagers as well. That's a stage that most parents feel a little lost in. I felt like when our kids turned the corner from, the toddler years and the school age years, I felt like all of my books needed to be thrown in the trash. I need to start over because it's a whole new way of parenting. It's a whole new set of concepts, but the development idea really fits well because when you understand you're 15, sometimes we'd even say that, honestly, sometimes they probably got frustrated. We'd say, "Oh, you're rolling your eyes. That's so 16. How cute."
Yeah.
Very different reaction than getting angry.
That's true. And our kids actually started using development against us in terms of they're like, sarcasm, that's just what I'm supposed to be doing.
Teenagers love language.
And I'm like, oh no, they've been reading the books I've been bringing home. But it does then give a shared conversation that you can have that's not about willfulness. And I think like teenagers and 2-year-olds, since those are the 2 we talked about, there's a lot of similarities because it's about will, right? I need to demonstrate I'm separate from you.
Discovering new independence.
2-year-old is just little and kind of doesn't use any logic. The same thing is going on with an adolescent, but they're using logic, not judgment, but logic. And it can look different. But if we have a frame of, they're still working through the same idea, the whole point here is it frees us up to do something different.
It does. Yeah. It's really helpful.
And it's helpful if you're on the same page as a parenting team. I know headwise, I know these things, but there were moments when I would say certain things or respond a certain way, and you'd be like, are you sure? And we had the playful, we would cite authors to each other. Like, is that what Eric Erickson's talking about?
Well, that's you. That's not me.
But you would gently use the shared kind of messages around
Yeah.
development that would help. It would give me a moment to pause
Hmm.
and respond differently. So I think, especially with our with you focus, thinking developmentally is helpful. But again, in relationship with each other,
Hmm.
doing that as a community of a child parent, two
To have the same
parents,
understanding.
yeah, kind of a shared meaning that you can.
Right. It's kind of what you see sometimes in the grocery store when that toddler is having a meltdown and the new parent is embarrassed because they still have some illusion of control over
Yeah,
their child's behavior.
yeah.
And the older folk in the grocery store are the ones saying that child just probably needs a snack and a nap
Hmm.
because they have, the past experience and understanding that there's a developmental need for more frequent meals and,
Yeah.
they have less endurance. It's their abilities kind of have to match what you're expecting of them.
Yeah, it's really good to think about development out there. I think the challenge for that parent in the grocery stores and what's developmentally happening for them, like where
Mhm.
are they? What's their task? What's the stressors on them,
Mhm.
as well as thinking about the child, because it's both. It's not like we're as parents not going through any developmental tasks or any developmental change or kind of growing and so where are we and how does that also contribute to the relationships?
Right.
Really, really
So
important.
this applies to relationships as well as just people and their stages of development. So we think about our own relationship in terms of you see new couples who are ooey gooey in love, and that's obviously the honeymoon stage or the even before the honeymoon stage, the falling
Yeah,
in love stage.
yeah.
And you go through different times of change where, I mean, you could assign a task to those stages of relationship or just,
Hmm. Well, and we, as a marriage and family therapist, as a doula, we do have ideas of stages for that. Like I like
mm-hmm,
the ooey gooey. That's really
mm-hmm.
nice. I think of it as that kind of maximizing similarities and minimizing differences. So if there's a task for that early on, it's and you see it like, hey, if we were at our early stage in relationship, we might have even had this conversation of, hey, Tara, what would you like to do tonight?
I'd like to do whatever you'd like to do.
Oh, that's great. Well, I want to do what you want to do. You
What do
get
you,
the
where do
idea.
you want to go? No, where do you want to
That's right.
go?
And if we happen to get an idea of like we want to go out for food, then it's like, well, what restaurant would you like to go to? And we'd have this back and forth, right? To not, if I take a position,
It might be different than your position.
yeah, and all of a sudden there's a fracture of an early developmental relationship. So these are ways of thinking about whether it's a 2-year-old or a young committed relationship. We have these developmental tasks, and if you have a reasonable expectation based on development, it frees you up to look at, oh, these are our strengths right now, and this is too much too soon.
Huge part of it is assigning strengths to the different stages and understanding that those are going to change in the different times of change. So, the other piece that we think about with development is a huge part of why this is important is because we'll have different expectations for people depending
Hmm.
on where they are in that stage.
Right.
Like, you can't expect that toddler to get up every morning, get himself dressed, get his own breakfast, and be standing by the door ready to go to preschool. It's not going to happen. It's not
Yeah.
developmentally possible. So that can create a lot of conflict
Hmm.
when our expectations don't match what's possible.
Yeah.
So putting that frame on it and changing our expectations of ourselves too. We
Yeah.
have to apply this to where we are and give ourselves some grace sometimes.
It does make me think that's so true, and those expectations come developmentally and they come culturally. Like during COVID, we binge watched a show that has little kids going off and
Oh,
doing
right.
tasks,
That's
right?
right.
So as we were talking about that, I was like, oh well, what about those kids that are 2 to 5 that are being sent out to do complicated tasks? Like
Right.
I wouldn't do
And
that
that
to my
seems
child.
bizarre in our culture, but
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. There's a different lens in different places for different developmental abilities, I would guess.
Yeah, so the structure of how do we think developmentally is really important. Our expectations are really important, and where do those expectations come from?
Hmm.
So there's the capacity And do we know the difference between capacity and then what cultural constraints put on that?
Right.
But yeah, I still wouldn't necessarily trust my kids to do an errand to drive to the airport and that's a cultural and personal
we're
issue.
both firstborns. We have trouble letting go of control. So we'll freely admit that.
Yes.
So that's part of why this is helpful for us personally, to understand that we don't have control over our children.
Yeah.
Especially in certain stages, they have certain things that are possible, certain things that are not, and maybe we hold them back from some of what's possible.
Yeah, because with that, there needs to be optimal frustration.
Right.
I mean, that's a fancy term, but it's just we can't do everything for them, even though sometimes we want. Otherwise, they're not going to learn and not going to be able to go through those stages.
Right.
And that was a really hard thing for us. Optimal frustration.
I think that's hard for everybody.
Oh, I hope so. If you have trouble with optimal frustration, please reach out to us, because otherwise we'll feel we're just the only ones.
Yeah. But I mean, the whole point for all of this, for everything that we're talking about, is to take away some of the challenge in relationships, because relationships are hard.
Mm-hmm.
And the transitional times that we're talking about, like adolescence and like getting married and having a baby and all of these big changes, are hard. So part of making it easier is just understanding where we're coming from and what's possible. Yeah. That's why we think development and understanding what's possible can help make it easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good stuff.
Yeah. Hey, you want to go develop something?
Always.
All right. Have a good afternoon, evening, or night. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
We invite you to visit our show notes page and website for more resources and information.
If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast and share with your friends. That would be a huge favor to us.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.